It was an ordinary Tuesday night at the gas station on Route 46, the kind of place where time seemed to stretch and the hours dragged like a slow-moving fog. Emma had worked the night shift for months, and while the monotony could be dull, she didn't mind the quiet. The customers were few, mostly truckers passing through or late-night travelers desperate for caffeine. But tonight felt different, thicker, darker. Around 11:30, the fluorescent lights above the counter began to flicker. Emma sighed and made a mental note to tell her manager. As she leaned down to retrieve her book from her bag, the bell over the door chimed. She straightened quickly, plastering on her best polite smile, but the entrance was empty. The glass door swung lazily back and forth before settling. "Hello?" she called out, her voice cutting through the hum of the coolers. No answer. She shook it off, blaming the wind. But as she turned back to the register, she saw something that made her heart stop. A set of muddy footprints trailed across the tiled floor, leading from the door straight to the candy aisle. "Great," she muttered, trying to sound annoyed rather than unnerved. She grabbed the flashlight from under the counter and stepped out. "We're closed for cleaning," she said loudly, her voice echoing in the quiet space. No response. The footprints stopped abruptly at the end of the aisle, but no one was there. Emma's skin prickled, and she forced herself to laugh. It was probably a prank. Teenagers messing around. But as she returned to the counter, she froze. The back door, the one that led to the storage room, was wide open. She hadn't opened it. She never used that door. Emma grabbed her phone, her fingers trembling as she dialed her manager. It rang and rang before finally going to voicemail. She left a rushed message, her voice shaking as she explained what had happened. Then she locked the front door and turned off the lights in the main area, retreating to the back office where the security monitors were. She locked that door too, just to be safe. The black and white screens showed the interior of the store and the parking lot. Everything was still. She fast-forwarded through the footage, trying to find when the footprints appeared, but the feed glitched every time it hit the moment the bell over the door chimed. Frustrated, she rewound again, watching closely. This time she noticed something she hadn't before. In the corner of the screen, near the coffee machines, a shadow lingered. It didn't move, didn't shift, just stayed perfectly still, even when the footage glitched. Her stomach dropped as she realized it hadn't been there earlier in the night. Then the power went out. The monitors blinked off, plunging the office into pitch-black silence. Emma fumbled for her flashlight, her breath quickening. She clicked it on and pointed it toward the door. The beam of light wavered as her hands shook. From somewhere outside the office, she heard the faint sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, they echoed in the quiet store. They weren't heavy enough to belong to a trucker. These were softer, almost hesitant. "Hello?" she called out again, her voice cracking. She immediately regretted it. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, the silence was worse than the sound. Then a soft tapping began on the office door. Tap, tap, tap. Emma pressed her back against the far wall, clutching the flashlight like a weapon. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. She stared at the door, waiting for it to burst open, but it never did. Instead, a voice whispered from the other side. "Let me in." It was barely audible, almost like a child's voice. But there was something wrong with it, something off. Emma felt tears sting her eyes as she shook her head, even though whoever or whatever was on the other side couldn't see her. The tapping stopped. She held her breath, listening. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Then the doorknob began to rattle violently, as if someone was trying to force it open. Emma screamed, her voice bouncing off the walls of the tiny office. The rattling stopped abruptly, and she heard the footsteps again, retreating this time. Summoning what little courage she had left, Emma crept to the monitors. The power was still out, but the emergency lights in the store had come on, casting long, eerie shadows across the aisles. The figure was back, standing near the counter now, staring directly at the camera. Except it wasn't a person. Its head was tilted at an unnatural angle, and its limbs were too long, bending in ways that made Emma's stomach churn. Its face was featureless, save for a gaping black mouth that seemed to stretch endlessly. As she watched, it raised one long, spindly arm and pointed toward the office door. The flashlight flickered, and Emma screamed as the office door slammed open, the lock snapping as if it were made of paper. The last thing she saw before the light went out completely was the shadow, now impossibly tall, folding itself into the doorway. When the morning shift arrived, they found the store locked from the inside. The office door was wide open, the flashlight lying on the floor with its batteries drained. There was no sign of Emma, only a trail of muddy footprints leading from the office to the back door, which stood ajar. No one took the night shift after that. It was the dead of winter, and Jason had just started his new job as the night guard at St. Vincent's Psychiatric Hospital. The building had been decommissioned years ago, and though its exterior loomed over the frozen landscape like a crumbling fortress, the hospital was slated for renovation. Jason was hired to watch over the site, ensuring no vandals or thrill-seekers trespassed. It sounded easy enough, until his first shift. The security office was small and freezing, barely heated by an aging radiator that hissed every few minutes. On the desk, a collection of dusty monitors displayed feeds from the scattered cameras set up in the building. Most of them were grainy or staticky, but they were enough for Jason to keep an eye on things. The first few hours were uneventful. He passed the time scrolling on his phone, occasionally glancing up at the monitors. Midnight came and went without incident, and he was starting to think the stories about St. Vincent's, stories of shadowy figures and strange noises, were just urban legends. At around 1:15 a.m., he noticed movement on one of the screens. Camera 6, which covered the main corridor of the second floor, showed a figure standing at the far end of the hall. Jason leaned closer to the monitor, his heart beginning to race. It looked like a person, tall, thin, wearing what might have been a hospital gown. Probably just a squatter, Jason muttered to himself, grabbing his flashlight and the radio clipped to his belt. He made his way through the building, his boots echoing against the cracked linoleum. The air grew colder as he ascended the stairs, his breath visible in the dim light. The second floor was darker than the rest of the hospital. Several of the emergency lights had burned out. Jason clicked on his flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness. "Hello?" He called out, his voice echoing down the empty hall. "This is private property. You need to leave." No response. As he moved further down the corridor, he felt an unsettling pressure, as though the air itself was heavier. The faint scent of antiseptic lingered, mixed with something metallic, something like blood. Jason reached the spot where the figure had stood, but there was no one there. He shone his flashlight around, illuminating the peeling paint and broken doors. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw movement. He whipped the flashlight toward it, but the beam only revealed an open door at the end of the hallway. Room 237. Jason hesitated. The rational part of him screamed to turn around, to go back to the safety of the security office, but curiosity, or maybe pride, pushed him forward. He approached the room, his flashlight trembling in his hand. The door creaked as he pushed it open. The room was empty, its walls covered in faded, childlike drawings. Stick figures, houses, suns with smiling faces, all scrawled in red crayon. At least, Jason hoped it was crayon. In the center of the room was an old hospital bed, its mattress yellowed and torn. The restraints hung loosely from the sides, swaying slightly as if they'd just been touched. Then he heard it. A faint giggle, high-pitched and childlike, coming from somewhere behind him. Jason spun around, the flashlight illuminating the empty hallway. The giggle came again, closer this time. He felt his chest tighten, his breath quickening. "Who's there?" he shouted, his voice cracking. The door to room 237 slammed shut behind him, plunging the room into darkness. Jason fumbled with the doorknob, but it wouldn't budge. The giggling grew louder, now mixed with whispers he couldn't understand. He turned back to the bed and his heart nearly stopped. The restraints were no longer swaying. They were pulled taut, as if something invisible was thrashing against them. The whispers turned into screams, deafening and filled with rage. Jason clawed at the door, kicking it until it finally gave way. He stumbled into the hallway, his flashlight flickering. As he ran back toward the stairs, he glanced at the monitor room from the corner of his eye. On every screen, the same figure appeared, standing motionless in front of the camera. Its face was blank, featureless, but its head followed him as he moved. Jason didn't stop running until he was outside in the freezing air. He quit the job the next morning, refusing to step foot in the hospital again. The renovation never happened. The contractors refused to stay on site after several workers reported hearing screams and seeing shadowy figures. St. Vincent's remains abandoned to this day, its halls filled with secrets no one dares to uncover. The town morgue was not a place anyone lingered, especially after sunset. Situated on the outskirts of a small, forgotten town, it was a low, squat building that seemed to exude cold even in the height of summer. For Thomas, it was just a job, a quiet gig for a man who preferred solitude. He worked the night shift, processing paperwork, logging in bodies, and ensuring everything was in order for the medical examiner the next morning. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills. One night, a violent storm rolled in, rattling the windows and plunging the town into darkness with a sudden power outage. The backup generator kicked on moments later, but the flickering fluorescent lights gave the morgue an even more sinister appearance. Thomas sighed, sipping his coffee as he prepared for another quiet night. Around midnight, the radio crackled with a message from the local hospital. They were sending over a John Doe, an apparent suicide victim found in the woods earlier that day. The paramedics arrived shortly after, wheeling in a gurney covered with a black body bag. The storm had delayed their arrival, and they looked as uneasy as Thomas felt. "Rough one, huh?" Thomas asked, trying to lighten the mood. One of the paramedics, a pale, wide-eyed young man, just shook his head. "You'll see," he muttered before they hurried out into the storm, leaving Thomas alone with the corpse. He wheeled the gurney into the storage room and unzipped the body bag. The man inside was emaciated, his skin pallid and stretched tight over his bones. His eyes were sunken, his lips drawn back in what looked like a grimace. But it was his hands that caught Thomas's attention. They were filthy, the nails jagged and caked with dirt as though he'd been clawing at the ground. Thomas shivered, chalking it up to the creepiness of his surroundings. He logged the body into the system and slid it into one of the cold storage drawers. The heavy door closed with a hollow thunk, and Thomas returned to his desk. An hour later, as the storm raged outside, Thomas heard it, the unmistakable sound of a drawer sliding open. He froze, the pen in his hand trembling. The storage room was behind him, its door slightly ajar. He told himself it was just his imagination, that the old building made noises in bad weather. But then he heard it again, the scrape of metal on metal. Gathering his courage, Thomas grabbed his flashlight and pushed open the storage room door. The light flickered as he swept it across the rows of drawers. All were closed, except for one, the drawer that held the John Doe. The body bag lay open, empty. Thomas's stomach dropped as he backed out of the room, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. A faint sound reached his ears, a soft, wet dragging, like something being pulled across the tiled floor. It was coming from the hallway. "Hello?" he called, his voice cracking. The dragging stopped. He shone his flashlight down the corridor, the beam catching movement at the far end. Something crawled toward him on all fours, its limbs bending unnaturally. The flashlight flickered, and when it steadied, the figure was gone. The hallway was empty. Thomas spun around, his back pressed against the wall, heart pounding in his chest. The morgue felt impossibly quiet now, the storm outside muffled, as though the building itself were holding its breath. Then, from the far corner of the room, he heard a sound that chilled him to the bone. A low, rasping breath, inches from his ear. He turned, but nothing was there. The lights went out, plunging the morgue into complete darkness. Thomas fumbled for his phone, the small screen barely illuminating his shaking hands. The sound of footsteps echoed around him, slow and deliberate, coming from every direction at once. Suddenly his phone was knocked from his hand, skidding across the floor. In the faint glow, he saw the John Doe crouched on the ground, its head cocked at an unnatural angle, its mouth opened impossibly wide, revealing rows of jagged, blackened teeth. Before Thomas could scream, the creature lunged. When the morning crew arrived, the morgue was in perfect order. The body of the John Doe was back in its drawer, zipped up neatly in the body bag. But Thomas was nowhere to be found. The only trace of him was his flashlight lying on the floor near the open storage room door, its bulb shattered. The morgue has since gained a reputation as a place no one wants to work. Every so often, during stormy nights, staff report hearing footsteps echoing through the halls, or a low, rasping breath behind them just before the lights go out. The diner off Highway 19 was a relic from another era, its neon sign buzzing faintly in the darkness. Open 24 hours, it served as a haven for truckers, late-night wanderers, and the occasional insomniac. Tonight, though, it was eerily quiet. The only sounds were the hum of the fluorescent lights and the occasional sizzle of the coffee pot. Lena worked the night shift alone, something she was used to after 2 years behind the counter. It was usually uneventful, lonely but peaceful. Tonight felt different, though. The air inside the diner was heavy, the kind of oppressive stillness that made her glance over her shoulder more often than she liked. At around 2 a.m., the bell above the door jingled, and Lena looked up. A man walked in, his face hidden beneath the shadow of a wide-brimmed hat. His clothes were drenched, water pooling on the tiled floor as he stepped toward the counter. "Rough night?" she asked, forcing a polite smile. He didn't respond, just slid into a booth near the window. His movements were slow, deliberate, as though every step required immense effort. Lena waited a moment, expecting him to call her over or ask for a menu, but he just sat there, staring out at the empty highway. "Can I get you anything?" she called out. Still, no response. Feeling uneasy, Lena grabbed a menu and walked over. She set it on the table in front of him, but when she looked at his face, she froze. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes, dark, sunken voids, seemed to absorb the dim light around him. "I'll bring you some coffee," she said quickly, retreating to the safety of the counter. As she poured the coffee, she glanced back at the booth. The man was gone. The chair where he'd sat was empty, the menu untouched. She hadn't heard the bell above the door ring again, nor the sound of footsteps. Her chest tightened as she stepped out from behind the counter to search the diner. She checked the bathrooms, the back storage room, even the parking lot outside, but there was no sign of him. Only the puddle of water on the floor remained, slowly spreading across the tiles. Trying to shake off the unease, Lena returned to her station. Maybe the guy had slipped out quietly, though that didn't explain how she'd missed it. She busied herself, wiping the counter, but her hands trembled slightly. Then the bell jingled again. Her head snapped up, but the door hadn't opened. Instead, the man was back, seated in the same booth as before. This time, he was looking directly at her. "Did you leave?" she asked hesitantly, her voice barely above a whisper. His lips curved into a faint smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. Slowly, he raised one hand and pointed to the corner of the diner, where the jukebox stood. The jukebox hadn't worked in years, but as Lena watched, it flickered to life. A crackly tune began to play, something old and mournful that sent chills down her spine. She took a shaky step back, her breath quickening. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice trembling. The man didn't answer. Instead, he stood and walked toward the door, his footsteps echoing unnaturally loud in the empty diner. As he reached the exit, he turned back one last time, tipping his hat. Then he stepped outside and vanished into the darkness. The jukebox fell silent. Lena stood frozen for what felt like hours, her heart pounding in her chest. Finally, she forced herself to move, locking the door and flipping the sign to "closed." She didn't want anyone or anything else coming in tonight. The rest of her shift passed in an anxious blur. By dawn, she was exhausted but relieved to see the first rays of sunlight creeping over the horizon. Her replacement, Carla, arrived right on time. "Tough night?" Carla asked, noticing Lena's pale face. "You have no idea," Lena muttered. Carla frowned as she walked behind the counter, setting her bag down. "Weird," she said, picking up a damp piece of paper from the counter. "This wasn't here last night." Lena looked at the paper, her blood running cold. It was an old newspaper clipping, yellowed with age. The headline read, "Local man found dead on Highway 19 after late-night accident." Below, it was a grainy black and white photo of the man with the wide-brimmed hat. The date on the article was from 30 years ago. The clock in the small-town library chimed midnight, its low, mournful toll echoing through the cavernous, empty space. Claire adjusted her scarf, shivering in the chill that always seemed to settle in after hours. She had been the head librarian for 3 years, and the quiet of the night shift was usually a comfort. But tonight, the silence was suffocating. The old library was built in the late 1800s, its architecture a mix of Gothic and Victorian styles, complete with towering shelves, iron spiral staircases, and a sprawling basement of archives. The basement Claire avoided whenever she could. The air down there was heavy, the shadows too deep. Around 12:15, the overhead lights flickered, as they often did. Claire muttered a curse and made a mental note to remind the maintenance team again. She was sorting through a cart of returned books when she heard it. The faint sound of footsteps. The library was supposed to be empty. She stopped, her breath catching as the sound grew louder. The steps were slow, deliberate, and seemed to come from the second floor. Claire grabbed her flashlight and called out, "Hello? The library's closed." No response. The steps stopped, and for a moment, the silence pressed down on her like a weight. She exhaled, trying to shake off her nerves, and turned back to the books. But then she heard it again, a faint shuffling, this time coming from the reading room down the hall. Claire hesitated. Protocol required her to investigate, but every instinct screamed at her to stay put. She grabbed her cell phone and dialed the security office number, but the line crackled with static before disconnecting. "Great," she muttered, gripping the flashlight tighter as she headed toward the reading room. The reading room was dark, the tall windows offering no solace as the moon was hidden behind thick clouds. She swept the flashlight beam across the rows of tables and chairs, but nothing seemed out of place. Still, the air was colder here, the silence even heavier. She was about to leave when she noticed something odd. One of the chairs was pulled out from the table, slightly askew. She distinctly remembered tidying this room earlier. It had been perfect. Claire moved closer, her pulse quickening. On the table, in the faint light of her flashlight, she saw a book lying open. The pages were old and yellowed, the text faint and written in a language she didn't recognize. She hadn't put it there. As she leaned in to examine the book, she felt it, a presence behind her. The tiny hairs on the back of her neck stood on end, and the air seemed to buzz with an almost imperceptible hum. She froze, her flashlight shaking in her hand. "Who's there?" she whispered, barely able to get the words out. A soft, breathy voice answered, "Reading." Claire spun around, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. No one was there, but the room felt wrong. The shadows seemed to shift and writhe as though alive, and the faint scent of old paper and damp earth filled her nostrils. The whisper came again, this time from the far corner of the room. "Stay, with us," she ran. Her footsteps echoed as she darted back into the main hall, the flashlight flickering wildly. The library seemed darker now, its familiar layout distorted and unfamiliar. She reached the front desk and grabbed her keys, desperate to leave. As she turned to unlock the front doors, she froze. A figure stood at the far end of the hall, barely visible in the dim light. It was tall and cloaked in shadow, its face obscured. In its hand it held a book, one of the library's books. Slowly it lifted a long, skeletal finger and pointed at her. "Leave," it hissed, but not for long. The lights went out completely, plunging the library into total darkness. Claire screamed, fumbling with the lock until it finally clicked open. She burst outside, gasping for air, and didn't stop running until she reached her car. The next morning, Claire returned with the maintenance team and the head of security. The library looked untouched, perfectly normal, except for the reading room. The book she had seen was gone, but on the table, carved into the wood, was a single word, "Return." Claire quit that day, and the library has struggled to keep night staff ever since. Those who dare stay past midnight report hearing whispers, footsteps, and the faint rustling of pages being turned in an otherwise empty room. The gas station on Route 7 was the kind of place you only stopped at if you had no other choice. Isolated and surrounded by endless fields, it stood as a lonely beacon in the middle of nowhere, its single fluorescent light flickering against the night. Marcus worked the graveyard shift, a job he'd taken out of desperation, though he regretted it almost every night. It was a quiet Tuesday, the kind of dead evening where Marcus could hear the hum of the cooler and the occasional buzz of a moth hitting the bulb above the counter. He was scrolling through his phone when the bell above the door jingled. A man stepped inside, tall and thin, with skin that looked almost waxy under the fluorescent lights. He wore an old trench coat, despite the warm weather, and his eyes were hidden beneath the shadow of a wide-brimmed hat. He didn't say anything as he moved slowly to the back of the store, his footsteps eerily quiet on the tile floor. Marcus watched him from the counter, knot of unease forming in his stomach. Something about the man felt off. He moved too smoothly, like he was gliding rather than walking. "Let me know if you need help," Marcus called, trying to sound casual. The man didn't respond. Instead, he stopped in front of the drink cooler, standing perfectly still for what felt like an eternity. Then, without opening the door, he turned and walked back to the counter. His eyes were dark, unblinking, and fixed on Marcus. "Where is it?" the man asked, his voice low and hollow. Marcus blinked, caught off guard. "Where's what?" The man leaned in, his presence overwhelming. His breath smelled faintly of something metallic, like rust. "You took it. I need it back." "I don't know what you're talking about," Marcus stammered, stepping back instinctively. The man's expression didn't change, but the air around him seemed to grow colder. The fluorescent light above the counter flickered wildly, casting strange shadows across his face. "You have until dawn," the man said, his voice like a growl. Then he turned and walked out into the night, disappearing into the darkness beyond the parking lot. Marcus stood frozen, his heart pounding in his chest. He locked the door, his hands trembling, and tried to shake off the encounter. Just some weirdo, he told himself. It wasn't uncommon for strange people to wander in during the night, but as the hours passed, things started to happen. The clock on the wall froze at 2:47 a.m., its second hand twitching in place. The radio behind the counter turned on by itself, blasting static at full volume before cutting off abruptly. Then there were the lights, the way they dimmed and brightened erratically, casting moving shadows that didn't match anything in the room. At one point, Marcus swore he saw a figure standing at the edge of the parking lot, just beyond the reach of the gas station's lights. It was tall and unmoving, but when he blinked, it was gone. By 3:30, Marcus was ready to call his manager and quit on the spot. He reached for his phone, but the screen was black, unresponsive. Frustrated, he turned toward the security monitors, only to see static on every feed, except one. The camera pointed toward the back storage room showed the man from earlier, standing motionless in the center of the room. His face was turned toward the camera, though his features were impossibly blurry, as if the lens couldn't quite focus on him. Marcus grabbed a wrench from under the counter and crept toward the storage room, his heart hammering in his chest. He pushed the door open slowly, the hinges creaking loudly in the stillness. The room was empty. He backed out quickly, shutting the door and locking it. But when he turned around, the man was standing on the other side of the glass door leading into the store. His face was pressed against the glass, his mouth stretched into a grotesque smile. Marcus stumbled back, dropping the wrench. He watched in horror as the man raised one hand and tapped on the glass. Once, twice, 3 times. Each tap echoed unnaturally loud, reverberating through the small store. The lights flickered and went out completely, plunging the gas station into darkness. Marcus fumbled for his flashlight, his breath coming in shallow gasps. When he finally turned it on, the beam illuminated the man standing just inches away, inside the store. "You're out of time," the man whispered. The flashlight flickered and died. The next morning, the station manager arrived to find the place locked, the lights off, and Marcus's car still parked outside. Inside, everything was in perfect order, except for the security footage. The final frame showed Marcus standing behind the counter, staring at something just out of view. His face was pale, his mouth open in a silent scream. The timestamp on the footage read 4 a.m. Marcus was never seen again. The gas station is still open, but the night shift position remains vacant. Locals say strange things happen there after dark. Whispers on the wind, lights flickering, and shadows that move where they shouldn't, but no one stays long enough to find out why. The graveyard shift at St. Mary's Hospital was notoriously quiet. The long, sterile hallways often felt more like the corridors of an abandoned building than a functioning medical facility. Allison, a nurse on her 3rd consecutive night shift, had always been skeptical of the stories whispered among the staff. Tales of strange happenings on the 4th floor, the one that had been closed for years. Officially, the 4th floor had been shut down due to budget cuts, but older staff members hinted at something more sinister. They spoke in hushed tones about unexplained noises, flickering lights, and shadows that moved when no one was there. Allison dismissed it as nonsense, a way for bored employees to entertain themselves during long nights. That changed during her 3rd shift. It started around 2 a.m. Allison was alone at the nurse's station, reviewing patient charts, when the elevator dinged. She glanced up, puzzled. No one was supposed to be using the elevator this late. The doors slid open to reveal an empty cab. She frowned, standing to peer inside. The button for the 4th floor was illuminated, glowing softly in the dim light. That's weird, she muttered, stepping back. The doors closed and the elevator ascended. The rational part of her brain tried to explain it away, maybe a maintenance issue or a glitch. But as the night wore on, the unease settled deep in her chest. At 3:15 a.m., the intercom crackled to life. Code Blue, just a voice announced, barely audible over the static. 4th floor. Allison's stomach dropped. Code Blue meant a medical emergency, but there shouldn't have been anyone on the 4th floor. She called the security desk, her voice shaking. Did you hear that announcement? The guard on the other end hesitated. Yeah, but the 4th floor's empty, right? Check the cameras, she urged. A long pause followed, then, that's not possible. There's someone up there. Her heart pounded. What do you mean? I'm looking at the feed, the guard said, his voice tight. There's a person standing at the end of the hall, just standing there. Allison grabbed a flashlight and headed for the elevator, her pulse racing. She couldn't shake the sense of dread clawing at her. When the doors opened on the 4th floor, she was met with darkness. The overhead lights flickered weakly, casting long, jagged shadows across the abandoned corridor. Hello? She called, her voice echoing. The air felt wrong, thick and oppressive, as though it were pressing down on her. She walked slowly, her footsteps echoing unnaturally loud. At the end of the hallway, she saw it, a figure standing perfectly still, its back to her. Sir? Ma'am? She called out, her voice trembling. You're not supposed to be here. The figure didn't move. Allison took a step closer, gripping her flashlight tightly. Her breath hitched when she realized the figure wasn't standing, it was hovering several inches off the ground. The temperature plummeted, her breath visible in the freezing air. The figure slowly turned and Allison's flashlight flickered violently before going out. In the darkness, she saw its face, or what should have been a face. Instead, there was nothing. A void, empty and endless. A guttural, inhuman sound filled the air, and Allison ran. She bolted down the hall, slamming the elevator button repeatedly. The doors finally opened, and she threw herself inside, jabbing the button for the ground floor. As the doors began to close, she saw the figure at the end of the hallway moving toward her with unnatural speed. The doors shut just in time, and the elevator descended. When she reached the ground floor, the guard was waiting for her, pale and visibly shaken. I checked the cameras, he whispered. That thing, it followed you to the elevator. But here's the thing, when the doors opened down here, nothing came out. Allison quit the next day. St. Mary's Hospital still operates, but the 4th floor remains sealed off. New staff sometimes ask why, but those who've been there long enough simply shake their heads and say, you don't want to know. The small roadside motel where Aaron worked the night shift had seen better days. The carpets were stained, the wallpaper was peeling, and the neon vacancy sign buzzed faintly through the dark. Most nights, the place was dead, just the occasional traveler looking for a cheap bed to crash in. Aaron didn't mind the solitude. He brought his headphones, listened to music, and watched the hours tick by. But one night, things felt off. It started just after midnight. Aaron was leaning back in the creaky office chair when the phone rang. The sound made him jump. It rarely rang this late. He hesitated before picking up. Motel Vista, he said. There was static on the other end, a faint voice, barely audible. Room 6. Excuse me? Aaron asked, leaning forward. Room 6, the voice repeated, distorted and crackling. Then the line went dead. Aaron frowned and glanced at the logbook. Room 6 hadn't been rented out that night. He grabbed the master key and headed outside, his breath visible in the chilly night air. The door to room 6 was closed, but as Aaron approached, he noticed the faint glow of a light seeping through the gap beneath it. His stomach churned. No one was supposed to be in there. Hello? He called, knocking on the door. This is the front desk. Is someone in there? No answer. Taking a deep breath, he unlocked the door and pushed it open. The room was empty. The bedside lamp was on, casting weak light across the dingy bedspread and cracked mirror. The air inside was stale, tinged with a faint metallic smell. Aaron turned off the lamp and backed out, locking the door behind him. He told himself it was probably a prank, or maybe someone had left the light on earlier and forgotten to report it. He returned to the office, trying to shake off the unease. At 2 a.m., the phone rang again. Aaron stared at it for a moment before answering. Motel Vista. This time, the voice was clearer, but it sent chills down his spine. You shouldn't have turned off the light. Aaron slammed the phone down, his hands trembling. His mind raced. Was someone watching him? Playing a joke? He checked the security cameras, but the grainy feeds showed nothing unusual. Just the parking lot. empty except for his car and the dimly lit hallway leading to the rooms. Minutes later, the phone rang again. He didn't answer. Instead, he watched the monitor, his eyes locked on the camera pointed at the hallway. As the phone continued to ring, the feed began to flicker. When it stabilized, Aaron's breath caught. A figure stood at the end of the hallway. Tall, with long, stringy hair and a face obscured by shadows, it stood perfectly still, facing the camera. The phone stopped ringing. Aaron stared at the screen, unable to move. The figure tilted its head slowly, as if studying the camera. Then, without warning, it started walking, straight toward room 6. The screen flickered again, and when it cleared, the hallway was empty. Aaron bolted the office door and grabbed the old, dusty bat kept behind the counter. His hands were slick with sweat as he waited, every small sound amplified in the silence. The minutes dragged on, but nothing happened. The cameras showed no movement. Just as he began to think it was over, the phone rang again. This time, it didn't stop. The shrill tone echoed in the tiny office, relentless. Against his better judgment, Aaron picked up. The voice on the other end was right behind him. Room 6 is waiting. He spun around, but the office was empty. The door was still locked, the windows untouched. He dropped the phone, his breathing ragged, and ran outside. The parking lot was silent, the motel bathed in eerie moonlight. But room 6 was different. The light inside was back on, glowing brightly through the curtains. Aaron didn't bother checking it again. He jumped in his car, sped out of the lot, and never returned. The motel manager found room 6 unlocked the next morning. The bed was unmade, the lamp still on, and the words, "Turn off the light again," scratched into the mirror. To this day, room 6 is permanently closed. No one rents it, and no one cleans it. The light, however, stays on. The old diner on Highway 46 was a relic of the past, a place most people didn't bother stopping at anymore. But it was the only thing open for miles, and for Sarah, it was a quiet spot to work her night shifts while saving for college. She liked the calm, usually just truckers or the occasional lost traveler passing through. But one night, as the clock crept toward 3 a.m., something changed. Sarah was wiping down the counter when the doorbell jingled. She glanced up, expecting a bleary-eyed driver or a drifter, but the man who walked in immediately set her on edge. He was tall, his skin pale as wax, with a gaunt face and deep-set eyes that seemed too black, too empty. He wore an old, tattered suit, the kind you'd see in pictures from the 1930s. "Just coffee, please," he said, his voice flat and toneless. Sarah nodded, trying to keep her hands steady as she poured. "Cream or sugar?" "No." He sat at the farthest booth, his back to the window. Something about the way he moved, slow and deliberate, made Sarah's stomach twist. She busied herself at the counter, trying not to look his way, but she couldn't shake the feeling that his hollow eyes were fixed on her. When she finally glanced over, he was staring directly at her. Sarah swallowed hard. "Everything okay with your coffee?" He tilted his head slightly, his lips curling into a faint, unsettling smile. "It's perfect." The clock ticked loudly in the silence that followed. Sarah tried to focus on her work, but the man didn't touch his coffee. He just sat there, unmoving, watching her with that eerie, unblinking gaze. Minutes felt like hours. Eventually, Sarah mustered the courage to break the tension. "Long drive?" she asked, her voice wavering. His smile widened, revealing teeth that seemed too sharp, too bright. "You could say that." The air felt heavy, oppressive. Sarah noticed her breath fogging slightly, as if the temperature had dropped. She glanced at the clock. 3:15 a.m. The hands of the clock seemed to tick slower, each second dragging painfully. The man finally moved, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out something small and slid it across the table. A coin. It spun briefly before landing flat. Sarah frowned. "What's that?" "Your payment," he said, his voice as cold as the air around him. "For what's to come." She didn't know what he meant, but her unease turned to outright fear when she saw the coin up close. It was ancient, worn, with symbols she didn't recognize carved into its surface. "I don't," she began, but the words died in her throat. The lights flickered. When they steadied, the man was gone. Sarah froze, her eyes darting to the front door. It hadn't opened. There was no sound, no sign of him leaving, but his coffee cup was still there, steaming faintly. The coin, too, remained on the table, gleaming ominously under the fluorescent light. Her hands trembled as she reached for the cup. It was warm, the liquid inside dark and thick. Not coffee. Blood. Sarah stumbled back, her breath coming in panicked gasps. She ran to the door, ready to lock it and call the police, but as she reached for the bolt, the neon sign outside flickered violently. The letters rearranged themselves, spelling something new. "You're next." The diner was empty when the morning staff arrived. Sarah was gone, the only clue to her disappearance a single coin left on the counter. No one talks about the diner now. The regulars stopped coming, and the night shift was quietly discontinued. But truckers passing by late at night sometimes report seeing a pale man in a tattered suit standing by the roadside, flipping a coin and smiling. Maggie's first night as the lone security guard at the Fairview Mall felt like a breeze at first. The sprawling complex had been closed for renovations for months, with most of the shops boarded up and the food court gutted. Her job was simple: walk the empty halls, check for break-ins, and stay awake until morning. Easy money, she thought. The first few hours passed uneventfully. Maggie wandered the dimly lit corridors, the sound of her footsteps echoing in the vast emptiness. Occasionally, she'd stop to scroll through her phone or sip from her thermos of coffee. By 1:30 a.m., boredom was starting to set in. That's when she heard it, the faint sound of footsteps. She froze, the hairs on her arms standing on end. The sound was distant, coming from the East Wing, where most of the construction work was still ongoing. It wasn't uncommon for homeless people to sneak into the mall, well, she reminded herself. Gripping her flashlight, she headed toward the noise. "Hello?" she called out, her voice breaking the silence. "This is private property. If anyone's here, you need to leave." There was no answer. The footsteps stopped. She reached the East Wing and shone her flashlight down the corridor. The empty storefronts loomed on either side, their dark interiors yawning like open mouths. Dust motes danced in the beam of light, but there was no sign of anyone. Maggie exhaled slowly and turned to leave, but as she did, she caught a glimpse of something in the reflection of a glass display case, a shadow moving at the end of the hall. Her heart skipped a beat. "Hey, I see you!" she shouted, her voice trembling slightly. She walked quickly toward the end of the corridor, the flashlight beam bouncing with each step. When she turned the corner, there was no one there, just an empty hallway and a single flickering light. But something caught her eye. On the floor, in the thick layer of dust, were footprints, small, barefoot, leading down the hall. The air felt colder now, and Maggie's breath came in shallow gasps. She followed the footprints cautiously, each step filling her with a growing sense of dread. They led to a storage room door at the very end of the wing. The door was slightly ajar, and a faint, rhythmic tapping sound came from within. Maggie hesitated, every instinct screaming at her to turn back. But she couldn't leave without checking. She pushed the door open slowly, the creak echoing in the stillness. The room was dark, filled with stacked furniture and construction supplies. Her flashlight beam swept over the space, illuminating dusty chairs and broken mannequins. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, until she found its source. In the far corner of the room, a figure crouched on the floor, facing the wall. Its back was to her, and it rocked back and forth as it tapped a single bony finger against the concrete. "Hey!" Maggie barked, her voice shaking. "You're not supposed to be here." The figure stopped moving. The silence was deafening. Then, slowly, it turned its head. Maggie's flashlight flickered, the beam catching glimpses of its face, a pale, featureless oval, with no eyes, no nose, just a mouth stretched into an impossibly wide grin. The grin didn't waver as it rose to its feet, its movements jerky and unnatural. Maggie stumbled back, dropping her flashlight. It hit the floor and rolled, casting erratic shadows across the walls. The thing began to move toward her, its grin growing wider, its limbs contorting as it advanced. She turned and ran, her pulse pounding in her ears. She didn't stop until she reached the security office, slamming the door behind her and locking it. Grabbing her phone, she dialed 911 with shaking hands. "There's someone in the mall," she gasped. There's something wrong with them. Please, send someone." The operator assured her that help was on the way. Maggie sat trembling in the office, her eyes glued to the monitors. She cycled through the camera feeds, desperately searching for the thing that had chased her. The East Wing camera showed nothing, just the empty hall. But then, one by one, the feeds began to flicker. When they stabilized, Maggie's stomach dropped. The figure was standing in the security office hallway, just outside the door. The grin filled the screen as the power went out. When the police arrived an hour later, they found the mall empty. The security office was locked from the inside, and Maggie was gone. Her flashlight was discovered in the East Wing, its beam still faintly glowing, and on the storage room floor, the footprints in the dust led to nowhere. The mall reopened months later, but the night shift position has remained vacant ever since. Rumors circulate about strange noises, flickering lights, and a grinning figure seen on the security cameras late at night.